Welcome to TechTalent Unlocked. I'm Anthony Ginn, and this is a series of podcasts where we'll be speaking to thought leaders about a range of topics that are close to our hearts here at my organisation, IQUAD. Across the series, we'll be exploring tech skills, skills gap, skills development, inclusion and culture, social mobility. But we're going to start the series with well-being and employee well-being. This is a very current thing, especially with the impact of COVID, working from home for such a long time for many people. And now also the thought process of transition of going back into the office. Today, we have James Gorman with us, who's the co-founder of BioMe, which is an employee wellbeing and performance organisation. We're going to dive into this topic and hope it will give people and employers a real insight to help performance and create a happier employee and culture. So James, thanks very much for being with us today. Really appreciate your time. Before we jump into some of the kind of questions about wellbeing, employee wellbeing, it'd be great to understand your journey into the world of wellbeing and what gave you that kind of passion to kick things off from your side.
Sure, thanks, Anthony. Yeah, well, it's a pleasure to be here, and this is a first for me doing a podcast. So in 2006, when I was 26, I ended up on the operating table having life-saving surgery, which was a bit of a shock. And while you'd thought that might have changed my my perspective on health and well-being, it really didn't until about 8 years later, when I started to figure out and finally came to the conclusion that my choices might actually have something to do with it. And then I got to work trying to figure out how to make those choices better and how to take back control of what I'd lost all those years before. And that took me back to more formal study, went back to university to study health and nutrition more formally, to sort of go alongside what I was doing with my own health and the experience that I'd had. And I started to think about, really at that point, how could I use these, use these new skills, this new knowledge to help other people perhaps not fall into the trap that I did, or even if they have, how do we help people, perhaps see another way. And take back that control. So I teamed up with an old friend of mine who is a physiotherapist and has been for many years, and an elite athlete. And we thought the skills that we both brought into looking at health a bit more holistically would be particularly useful, especially in the corporate environment, in the organization environment, where clearly people are recognizing now that this is so important. And, I think fairly unique perspective, I suppose, on both of our sides, where, I'd had that, experience of a very stressful job and didn't realize that perhaps that was contributing to my health issues until a bit later. So I understand the workings of organizations, how important employee well-being is. And Dave, my business partner, he's been helping heal injured police officers for the past 15 years. So really sees firsthand, the effect that having health problems can have on the performance in a sort of high pressure job like that. And so, yeah, we're really out now trying to help organizations achieve what most of them now want to achieve, which is to improve the health and happiness of their employees. The real question is, how do you do that? And that's what we've spent a long time, looking at and figuring out, and where we're starting to talk to organisations about it.
I think that's great. That's an amazing starting point for us. But I think it's amazing that you've recognised and reflected on the problems that you had personally, and actually just went back to the drawing book to actually try and resolve those for yourself, which is obviously a huge passion with a huge benefit to get right. Let's talk about the areas that we should focus upon. I think there's a couple of things, from my side. Well-being is, it's hugely fundamental to, our thought processes and our performance at work, and just life in general, though, right? So it'd be great to just get a bit of an insight for you about what areas, you know, we should focus on, and actually, what even are the areas? You know, do people even really know? You know, it'd be great to understand some of the fundamental pieces from yourself.
Yeah, it's an interesting point, because I think there's a lot of misinformation out there about, you know, what should be included in well-being generally, but particularly employee well-being. As I said, most organizations now want to do something with it. They recognize the importance, but it's hard to understand where to go. And I think it comes back to the principle that most organizations follow in every other, you know, strategic objective that they do, which is focus on what's most important. Focus on the things that are going to make the most difference to give you the best return on investment, ultimately. And when you look at well-being and you look at the data around it, there are 4 systems of health, so 4 systems of the body that contribute to well-being more than anything else. And they are metabolic health, so the way our body uses, processes, and stores calories. Then musculoskeletal health, which is really how well we move, how well our bones and joints and tissues feel. Mental health.
I'm glad you said that last one, James. Appreciate it.
Yeah. Mental health, you know, is talked about a lot now. Of course, that's an important one. And there's 2 parts to that. There's emotional health, which is sort of the big talking point at the moment, but there's also cognitive health, how well your brain functions and performs. And then the 4th one is immune health. And that's, of course, got a lot of airtime recently with a viral pandemic going on. But of course, it's always been important, you know, how well our body can defend itself from infections, how well it can heal from injury, how well it can balance inflammation in the body. So they're the 4 things that matter the most. And to our mind, they're the areas that companies should focus on.
Brilliant. And I suppose then, as being an employer, you know, now we've you know, you've highlighted the pieces that people should be looking at. You know, as an employer, what sort of knowledge or tools can they provide to the employees?
So again, I think it's the philosophy that should run through, you know, the whole well-being initiative, which is like focus on the things that make the most difference. And the same applies here. So if we've identified that those 4 systems of health that we talked about have the biggest contribution to well-being, again, not the only contribution, there are lots of other things that matter, you know, social well-being and financial well-being, and those things that are now getting more airtime, but they matter most. And if I could just go back to that for a minute, they matter because of the outcomes that they influence. So it's, what do we really care about here? When we're, you know, what does well-being actually mean? And it's become one of these kind of amorphous terms that means lots of different things and therefore means nothing. I think it's helpful to try and define what it really means. To our mind, there are four areas that matter for employee well-being specifically. One is longevity, so living longer. And I don't mean that in the sense of, well, you want to live to 120. I mean, I've got no interest in living to 120, frankly. But premature death is a problem. Nobody wants that. Like, you know, if there's preventable death in the working age population, that's a metric that matters, and it does happen, and it happens more frequently than people perhaps realize. So longevity is important. Quality of life is important, because if you think that's in many ways a definition of well-being, isn't it? It's how we feel, how healthy our lives are, and you know, the quality of that. Then when we look at work more specifically, we should look at work absence. There's some good data on that. And that's sort of the manifestation, if you like, of quality of life in the work environment. And then we've got performance at work. How, you know, if you're well enough to turn up to work, how well do you perform when you're there? And that's how we get to those 4 systems, really, because with premature death, the overwhelming problem is heart disease.
Yeah.
Been there for a long time. And that's really a metabolic health driven problem, followed by liver disease, which is predominantly an alcohol problem, followed by lung cancer, which of course is predominantly a smoking problem. So if it comes to premature death, they're the things. So metabolic health is really the key there. Quality of life, believe it or not, is the biggest problem there is musculoskeletal skeletal health, particularly low back and neck pain.
Okay.
If you think about well-being, quality of life terms, the biggest problem is how our body moves, physically functions, and feels on a day-to-day basis, and that's often, not part of the conversation, but it's crucial. And that's also a big part of work absence. Actually, it's the second leading cause of work absence is musculoskeletal problems. The first is minor illness, which probably most people, recognize: colds, flus, sickness bugs, headaches, stuff like that. So, and that's really an immune health problem. So you see immune health becoming important. Mental health, obviously important there as well, as it is the quality of life. And then with work performance, there's not as much data on that actually, because it's a different concept. But there is this phenomenon of presenteeism where people show up to work when they're ill or when they're not performing at full capacity. And you assume that those health problems that affect quality of life and work absence are also driving presenteeism, which means that people aren't performing at work, even if they show up. And I think, a big part of that, and again, I mentioned this at the start, but it's a component of mental health that doesn't really get any airtime, which is cognitive function. So things like memory and learning and decision-making, communication, all of those things about our brain, performing well, that's crucial to, most jobs, most roles. And unfortunately, it doesn't necessarily get the airtime that it probably should. So if they're the systems that matter, using a sort of data-driven approach, what are the most powerful levers we can use to influence those systems? And again, if we look at the data, there are three things that matter more than anything else, at least that we can control: our nutrition, so our diet, our movement, which is not just exercise, but how we move our bodies as well. We can come back to that if you want to later, and sleep. Right, so they're really the foundations of the things that we can control ourselves that most influence those important aspects of well-being. So to our mind, again, they should be the core focus of any employee well-being program. Again, they're not the only things that matter, but they are the foundations. It's like if you're building a house, you've got to build the foundations before you start polishing the windows.
Yeah, of course.
Right? And it's eat, move, and sleep that really helps you build that foundation. Now, the other crucial things, of course, like medical care. I mean, that's clearly extremely important here. We've got other well-being tools like meditation, which is getting more popular these days, and rightly so, and things like cognitive behavior therapy, counseling. They all matter. But they are much more effective if you already build a foundation around nutrition, movement, and sleep. Possibly first, but at least alongside.
Absolutely. And that was actually going to be my question. You've got two different lenses to look through here. You've got one as the individual themselves, and if there's one thing that they can do from what I'm hearing, from what you're saying, is to help build those foundations, set themselves up in the right manner, and it was eat, move, sleep, they're the things that potentially they can focus on. And is that something that you help individuals with to try and build a foundation that works for them? Because everyone's different. Me personally, I've got three young children, and that latter one, sleep, that's been a struggle over the last 6 years, trying to get a maximum amount of that. But as you say, everyone's in a slightly different environment, and so is it something that you build with individuals to tailor a program as such?
Yeah, it is, and that's a really good point. Look, everyone's different. They have different biology. All of the foundational principles are the same. Everyone's a bit different, certainly different circumstances, different jobs, different organizations. And so it has to be a tailored approach. I think a lot of people already know the kinds of, in many ways you think, well, we're not teaching people much to say that, food is important and movement's important and sleep is important. But we shy away from telling people what they should do. This is not about telling people, because actually what you find is if you tell people what they should do, they very rarely do it. For a number of reasons, right? One is because people don't like being told what to do.
Yeah.
And the other is you tend to do the things you want to do.
Yeah.
Rather than things you think, there are so many things we know we should do that we never do. And so this is about firstly identifying what could be the most effective eat, move, and sleep strategies that people could do for them, depending on what their goals and aspirations are. So that's really our job here. We can outline what the 5 or 6 most effective things they could do. You know, their aspiration might be weight loss or more energy, or just to be cognitively better, or to sleep, whatever it is. Highlight the most effective things and then help them to look at that menu and focus on the things that they want to do, the things that fit in with their circumstances, the things that they have enough motivation to do, but just need that help in actually doing it. That's by far the most effective way of changing how people eat, move, and sleep. So we tend to focus on that, and then that feeds into behavior change, because I suppose what we've talked about up to now is, what could you do? Yeah. So what areas of well-being could you focus on? What lifestyle levers could you pull? What do you want to do? What's going to be the most effective? But then I think by far the most important piece is how do you actually then do that? So it's all very, we all know, or a lot of us know what to do in lots of things. It's actually doing them that, where the change happens and what makes the difference. So we focus on behavior change a lot, and in many ways it's the leading edge of what we do. And there are 2 parts to that. One is quite obvious, which is individual behavior change. So taking the things that you want to do and actually putting them into practice. And what you need to do that is a system for understanding human behavior and how that applies to you, and a system for embedding and forming habits that you want and unwinding habits that you don't want. And the reason why that's really important is because once you know those skills, and once you've mastered those skills, you can apply them to anything you want. And it doesn't even have to be well-being related. And we think the nice thing about that is, and this is a big focus of ours, if you can equip people with the skills and the tools that they can use for a lifetime, they're much more likely to make long-term change, as opposed to, a 6-month program. And we have our doubts. There's a lot of 6-month programs out there that we don't think work particularly well. We can get into that, but so there's the individual behavior change, and we use a system called Tiny Habits, which is a really well proven system for reliable long-term behavior change, specifically in this case applied to well-being, applied to eat, move, and sleep, but it's useful for lots of other things. And the second piece of behavior change is cultural. So cultural within the organization, because as an individual, as you know, and you and I have worked together and we've worked in the same environment, even if you have all the tools as an individual, you know exactly what you're going to do and you know exactly how to do it. If the environment that you work in and the culture you work in doesn't support that, is not conducive to that, then you're much less likely to do those things. So, for example, if you know that you're set on having scrambled eggs and avocado for breakfast when you get to work, right? And you've got all these behavior change tools to enable you to do that. If you walk into the lobby and you're presented with, chocolate croissants in your face, it's much less likely that you're going to be able to continue this healthy breakfast habit, because ultimately that temptation is going to win, or it's going to make it very hard for you. You look around and what are the senior leaders doing in the organization? If they're not doing things for their well-being and the obvious things around taking care of themselves, then it's less likely that employees are going to do it. If the culture is that you're expected to answer emails at 3:00 in the morning, then it's not conducive to getting good sleep and improving sleep habits. So in many ways, the culture and the environment of the organization is kind of the most important piece of behavior change. So we think organizations need to look at that piece as well.
That's great. I mean, so at one point I've speaking about the 2 lenses, one from the individual, when we're talking about individual behavior changes, The second piece is obviously the employer themselves and the cultural changes that they can do there. And I imagine, and you mentioned this earlier, which is, the whole well-being piece can sometimes get a little bit misty in terms of what the definition is, and therefore a little bit lost in what they're trying to do within an organization. We've seen, obviously, from COVID, so many roles, and in fact, as many as possible, relocate individuals back working from home. And ultimately, prior to probably lockdown one, that was always seemed to be frowned upon in many different sectors as well. I'm just wondering, as the COVID kind of impacts that working from home, has that kind of opened employers' eyes a little bit more in terms of their flexibility? Which again, works hand in hand with enabling you to be able to work with them on a strong well-being program. And if so, can you give us a bit of an insight into what does that even look like? What does an employer program, well-being program, look like? And I suppose the final bit that I'll jump on just after that as well is that how do we try and maintain our well-being in a home environment where we then turn the home, going from a home into an office environment, which is a different piece. But yeah, if you could take us through an insight into how you work with employers and what their kind of programs may look like to change their organizations for the better, that'd be great.
Sure. So there's a few questions there that are really interesting. I think let me answer the main one first, which is, when you're working with employees, individual employees in a kind of a well-being program, we think the key there is, it needs to be intensive and it needs to be interactive, because ultimately you're learning new skills here and you're learning some complex and difficult skills. And arguably you're using or learning the most important skills you need, which is to look after your health and well-being. So we think that needs a lot of focus, and frankly, we don't think and a one-off seminar in an auditorium is really going to move the needle. It needs a lot more than that. The analogy we use quite a lot is if you want to learn to play tennis. If you want to learn to play tennis, you actually want to do it.
Yeah.
You don't go to a seminar with 1,000 people and walk out after an hour going, right, that's the tennis done, I can move on to something else, right? You hire a coach, you have a structured series of lessons and coaching over a period of time until you've have the confidence and the skill mastery to go away and do it yourself effectively. So we think this requires, and we think it deserves that same approach, because we think something short of that is not really fulfilling that desire to improve employee well-being, because you're just not gonna make the difference that you want. So that's the first bit. In terms of home and work environment, the same principles apply for a start, but of course there's some nuance around that. I mean, what's interesting is if you look at the well-being of employees during lockdown, when most people are working from home, you've got both physical and mental health have declined overall. Now there's a lot of factors involved in that. It's not just working from home. You've got the problem with the pandemic overall and the anxiety associated with that and everything else. But what you have is, and this goes back to behavior change, when you go from an office environment to working from home, your whole routine falls away.
Yes.
So every positive sort of lifestyle thing you were doing in an office environment, like walking to the train station or walking to work or getting your lunch from a particular, healthier type of fast food place or whatever it is, they all fall away. And you've kind of got to start again, if you want to do some of those things. And that's really difficult because you've got to do it now in the context of home, where you're on Zoom 12 hours a day.
Yeah.
You've got the things you need in your house, so you're not going out as much, you're not getting outside. And so it's no wonder that health has kind of declined overall during lockdown. That said, clearly the flexibility of being able to homework and office work going forward, I think people have, enough people have said that's important for their well-being, that it's something for organizations to take note of. But in terms of how you operate from an eat, move, sleep perspective and a habits perspective at home and at work, you actually require you're required to rebuild some of those good habits or build new good habits, because you'll have lost them when you switch routines. So when people move back into an office environment, they're probably going to have to go through that process again to either rekindle the good habits they had before,
absolutely,
to unwind some of the bad habits they've built up, and to hopefully build some new better habits again in what will probably be a very different office working environment.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose for an employer perspective as well, but they're trying to manage both instances now as well, creating that cultural change internally, but also trying to look out for their employees whilst they're working from home as well, which is very difficult because of the individualistic setup that everyone actually has. And I think that's tough. And certainly, the roller coaster of the pandemic as I'm sure thrown many people's routines, good and bad, out of the window. I suppose it'd be great just to kind of get some of the real benefits for people to take away in terms of what are sort of the easier things that people can take on themselves, because I'm sure it has to be a bit by bit approach that you try and deliver to people, and what are the sort of things that potentially, I don't know, maybe can give people some more energy, for example, in terms of, especially as I imagine they're going to start coming back into the office 2 to 3 days, that's going to be a bit of an impact to them, starting to go through that journey process again, maybe traveling into a major city. What's the sort of kind of process that you go through with some of these guys to try and ensure that they're getting more energy to be able to ultimately perform better for the week?
Yeah, that's a good question, and probably could be an extremely long answer.
Okay.
I'll keep it. Maybe I'll give what I think is the most helpful advice that people could actually use. I do think that, and if people are working from home, they can control this a lot more. So it's quite an interesting one. And organizations, as I said before, should focus on this in an office environment, is structure your environment to make healthy choices the path of least resistance. Okay. And what I mean by that is, it's just normal in human behavior. We always take the easiest route. Okay. We always want convenience. So the question is, can we make our environment, and this is particularly relevant for things like diet and exercise, how do we just make it maybe even the only choice, but certainly the easier choice? So for example, if you stock your kitchen cupboards with biscuits and crisps and chocolate and cakes, then that's how your diet is going to look. If you stock your kitchen cupboards with healthier options and your fridge is full of fresh food that is perhaps very easy and quick to prepare, or maybe you prepare it in advance, suddenly they become the path of least resistance, and you're more likely to eat that way. And if you want a packet of biscuits and you have to go to the shop to buy them, you're probably less likely to go and do it versus being in your cupboard, right? So it's extremely powerful is to think about, even before you even consider, individual behavior change, can you structure an environment to make the healthy choices that you want to make easier? Another example might be, if you want to do, go out for a walk in the morning, then you could leave your whatever gear you wear for walking and your shoes at the bottom of your stairs. Yeah. So as soon as you get up in the morning, there's your stuff. You put it on and you go. So the things you can do to tweak your environment just to make those things, well, not only remind yourself, but also make them easier to do. And that's really powerful. Because as soon as you start doing that, it tends to then spread into other aspects of your life and your environment.
Yeah, absolutely. And, that could then move on and small things, as you said, like walking to, the station or the tube, and maybe taking the stairs rather than the lift, etc. Is these little things tend to hopefully build. But I think, when we go back to the beginning of this conversation, is that a lot of these individual behavioural changes it takes someone that needs to reflect upon that, and whether it's themselves that want to do this, or whether it's an organisation that can present this to their employees, I think is a great thing as well.
Yeah, and you've made a really good point there, which is when people start going back to the office, walking even part of your commute is really beneficial. So obviously you're getting more physical activity, but you're just getting outside more. You're getting a bit of sunshine, or even if the sun's not shining, you're getting daylight, which will help you sleep at night. And there's all sorts of benefits in and around that. So I think you've hit the nail on the head. It's sort of one new thing you can do as you transition back to an office. It's walk some or all of your commute to work. And as you said, you can start really small. And in fact, we encourage people to start small. You could start by just walking to your nearest tube station, which you probably did before lockdown anyway. Yeah. And as you make that into a habit, at some point you can start walking a bit further maybe, or perhaps getting off at a stop that's one stop away from work and walking the rest. And you can build those things up slowly. It's kind of a core tenet of reliable behavior change. And you find that over time, if you've set yourself up properly, that can build. And this is what I mean by the focus should be on, having the skills to be able to apply it to any aspect of wellbeing or anything else you want to for a lifetime. Instead of, there's a lot of, as I mentioned before, a lot of these sort of 6-month programs out there, and a lot of wellbeing companies do this, where you have a sort of a battery of tests at the start, so that blood tests and body composition and fitness and all that, and they're useful, by the way, because it's helpful for people to understand where their health is. And they then from that advise people what they should be doing. We've already talked about the problems with what you should be doing. And then they have sort of a monthly accountability where you have to come and meet someone and tell them how well you've been doing, and sort of report back. And there's that focus around that. And then you get tested after 6 months, right? So those same blood tests, same body composition tests, same fitness test, and you see how you've changed. Now, the interesting thing about that is, I always ask the question, why 6 months? Why do they tend to be 6 months? And again, if you look at health research, particularly diet and exercise trials, you see that progress always peaks at 6 months.
Oh, right. Okay.
Right, always, and it always declines after that on average.
Right. Okay.
Right, and that's even if the trial continues beyond 6 months, never mind if it stops. So doing a new exercise program or a strict diet for 6 months tends to be possible, and then it starts to fall away because it hasn't been built with a long-term behavior change emphasis.
Yeah.
And that initial motivation and accountability only lasts for so long, and so results can tend to look really good at 6 months, and then they start to look less and less good over time. So we kind of shy away from that, because what we're trying to do is give people control and give them enough mastery of these skills that they can do it for in the long term, because that's what 6 months doesn't matter. What matters is 5 years and 10 years. Yeah. And that's what we're focused on.
Amazing. Brilliant. Well, look, thank you very, very much for your time today. Thank you for your insights, certainly across individuals and organisations. I wish you, great luck for the year ahead, and I certainly hope that people will be listening to some of these insights and ultimately benefiting from them as well. And I think that taking the small steps to lead to bigger ones, and taking some of the advice that we've spoken about, hopefully will increase their productivity, but just give them a happier life, and that's got to be a good thing. So Thanks very much again, James. Really appreciate your time on this podcast. And certainly the next podcast series will be out very soon. And if anyone else needs to kind of get back to James at BioMe, then you certainly probably can connect with him via LinkedIn. Otherwise, thanks very much for your time.
Thanks, Anthony. It's been a pleasure.